We have with us tonight Sandy Bowden.
Okay, good evening, welcome. Clackmannanshire must have had a serious amount of good quality water over the years, because there were a lot of breweries, there were a lot of mills, a lot of distilleries, and they all needed good quality water. In distilling, for example, there were 8 large distilleries in Clackmannanshire. Canvas, which lived till 93, Carsbridge, which at one point was the largest distillery in Europe, Glencoe, Grange, which was the first to put in a coffee still, I'll talk about that later on, Kilbeggie, which in 1799 was the largest distillery in Scotland, Kennet Pans, and we'll talk about Kilbeggie and Kennet Pans. Lindmill was there for a short period of time, and Strathmore again, not established until 1957, but again was a big distillery. It was situated on the site of what was Knox's brewery in Canvas, so it was literally across the road from Canvas Distillery. Clackmannanshire is 159 square kilometres in size. It's less than a quarter the size of the island of Alloa. So with distilling like that, it shows the quality of the water. The distilleries originally, Canvas, Carsbridge, Glencoe, Grange, yes, all of them other than Strathmore would have started with pot stills, because continuous production was not established until Steen's invention of 1828, and so they were established in the 18th century, and they would all have started, Carsbridge and Canvas as well, as pot still production. In 1786, there were 881,969 gallons exported to England. And they were exported it not as whiskey, but for gin production. The gin producers in London complained mightily to Westminster, and the excise duty on the exports was increased in 1788, which caused a number of distilleries across the Central Belt to go into sequestration. What you have to bear in mind is that until 1826, there wasn't an excise act that worked. But if you were a distiller across the Central Belt of Scotland, you couldn't hide from the customs and excise. I'm not saying that they were truly truthful about everything they produced and everything they paid tax on, but they couldn't hide the fact that they were distilling. And because the illicit hooch was coming in off the hill into town centres, because it was reckoned that there were in 1756, there were 400 illicit stills in Edinburgh and only 9 licensed stills. And the illicit stills obviously weren't paying duty, so therefore their product was a lot cheaper than the legal stills. So the legal stills were being run faster and faster. They were distilling in minutes instead of hours, so the quality coming out of them at that point in time was pre-1823 was not very good. Pot until 1828, as I said. Canvas moved on to continuous distillation in 1836. Glencoe moved on in 1846, and Carsbridge moved on to continuous distillation in 1852. The distilleries were big in terms. In 1799, we'll show you where the distilleries were at that point in time. Basically, Canvas was here, Strathmore or north of Scotland is here, Glencoe is here, Grange here, Carsbridge here, Lindmill here, Kennet Pans down by the river here, and Kilbeggie where the recycling plant is. Basically, Three of these distilleries, Canvas, Carsbridge and Glencoe, were half of DCL, Distillers Company Limited, in 1877. Originally, John Bald at Carsbridge had joined a Scottish grain producers organisation which was set up to set prices in 1856, and it was what we would now call a cartel. It was supposed to last for a year. It lasted 9 years. Then DCL was established in 1877 with, as I said, Canvas, Carsbridge, Glencoe, Port Dundas in Glasgow, Cameron Bridge, and Kirkliston distilleries. So basically, Clackmannanshire provided 50% of grain whisky production in 1877. Kilbeggie and Kennet-Pans, as I said, were exported to London, and until 1828, everything was, wrong one, everything was pot still production. In 1799, in the statistical account of Clackmannan, the Reverend Moody stated that the distillery at Kennet-Pans, which is advantageously situated on the very banks of the River Forth, was in proportion to that of Kilbeggie as 3 to 5, and before these two distilleries were stopped, by stopped I mean sequestrated, they paid to government an excise duty considerably greater than the whole land tax of Scotland. At present, in 1799, the duty paid by both is £8,000 sterling, and that's the equivalent of 1.6 million nowadays. So the government was taking a lot of money from just these two distilleries. Robert Steen was at Kilbeggie. His father, John Steen, was at Kennet-Pans. In the mid-1750s, when Kennet-Pans was set up, it was the largest distillery in Scotland. But obviously, Kilbeggie became much larger. Because they're pushing the stills very quickly, they're trying to find some way of producing spirit quicker and producing a spirit that is drinkable at the end of the day. And there was a lot of experimentation went on into continuous distillation. Robert Steen was the first to produce an effective continuous still. The downside with his still, which was patented in 1828, was that the shells on which the spirit condensed were made of haircloth, and the acid in the spirit burnt through the haircloth, so they weren't sustainable. There was a former Inspector General of Excise in Dublin by the name of Aeneas Coffey, and in 1824 he took over the docked distillery in Dublin, and he took Steen's invention and he improved it. He made the shells not of haircloth but of copper, so they were sustainable. And his patent was patented in 1833, and every continuous still around the world nowadays is based on Coffey's invention. At that point in time, Scotch whisky was small in world terms, and Irish whisky was much, much larger. They reckon that by the middle of the 19th century, there were 2,000 distilleries in production in Ireland, whereas in Scotland, I think we had 184, the largest number we had. The Irish distillers would not accept Coffey's invention because they saw him as a competitor, and they argued that their single pot still production was better than the production coming out of the continuous still from Coffey. The Scotch whisky distillers, looking for something to make life easier and cheaper, grasped it with both hands. The first distillery to put a Coffey still in was Grange in Alloa in 1834, followed by Cameron Bridge, and as I said, Canvas went over in what date was it? Cambus went 1836, Glencoe 1846, and Carsbridge 1852. So they all moved on to the coffee still because the steam invention was not sustainable. Andrew Usher was a blender in Edinburgh. He was a grocer, and he produced teas and he produced preserves. They reckon nowadays that it was his wife who did the blending, but he had a contract to sell 600 casks of Glenlivet every month, and he came up with the bright idea of blending the Glenlivet with continuous or still productions or grain whiskey, because malt whiskey is flavoursome and grain whiskey is less flavoursome normally. If you think about it, the gas chromatographical picture, you've got high points in flavour and low points in flavour. With malt whiskey, Major David McKessock, who used to own Glen Grant, said it's not what we take out of the product in distillation, it's what we leave in that gives it its character. And by that he meant the high points of flavour and the low points of flavour. Whereas a continuous still grain whiskey, the high points are lower and the low points are higher, so you've got a much more refined spirit at the end of the day. Arguably a much more elegant spirit at the end of the day. But it has this reputation of being coarse because a lot of people have only tasted it when it's young. And as we'll see tonight, it develops beautiful flavours with maturation and age. But in its youth, it still is fairly coarse. So Andrew Usher created this blend, and that created the demand for continuous still whiskey. The whiskey barons, Tommy Dewar, Alexander Walker, James Buchanan, created their business by copying what Usher had done in Edinburgh. In 1853, vatting under bond was allowed. So previously, if you wanted to vat it, you had to do it with duty paid, but allowed under bond, so it permitted distillers around the country to embrace this activity. And Usher's Old Vatted Glenlivet was released, and the companies of McKinley and Lowry, which are still around today, were established on the back of that. How many of you have been around distilleries? All of you? Yes, you know what a pot still looks like, and they're relatively small. The largest distillery here in Scotland, the largest pot still distillery in Scotland at the moment is Glenfiddich, believe it or not. 43 stills producing something like 43 stills producing 24 million litres of alcohol. People think of Glenfiddich as a small distillery. Springbank produces 100,000 litres, well, full stop. Glengoyne produces 900,000 litres, full stop. But Glenfiddich produces 28 million. Cameron-Bridge, on the other hand, grain distillery, 136 million litres of alcohol. So the continuous still distilleries in Scotland are 7, and they produce more spirit than all 145 malt whiskies put together. So that shows the size of them. So basically what happens within a continuous still is that the wash goes in there, the high alcohol beer goes in there and falls down. And steam goes in, faints go in here and steam goes in here. So steam rises through there, up through the wash pipe, through the vapor pipe, and rises through here. As it rises, it heats the wash. The wash comes up through here, falls down through here, evaporates, goes up through the vapor pipe again, and then comes off at whatever strength you want to take it off at. North British in Edinburgh takes it off the still at 94.6% alcohol. The highest alcoholic strength you're allowed to distill to in Scotland and still call it Scotch whisky is 94.8% alcohol. The highest alcoholic spirit in the world is a spirit from Poland called Polish Pure Spirit, 100% alcohol. So basically, instead of having 2 separate pot stills or 3 separate pot stills. You have got 2 sides to it with the cold wash coming in here, being heated up, and then evaporating and taking off whatever strength you want to add. The industry embraced, because the invention was originally Steen's, and so therefore it's another Clackmannanshire invention. And the 3 families, the Steens, the Haigs, and the Jamesons, all originated in this area, all farmed in this area, all distilled in this area. Admittedly, Haigs had a farm this side, or between Kilbeggie and Kennetpans, but they didn't distill within Clackmannanshire. The Steens did, and Jameson, he was a lawyer here in Alloa, but he also bought into a distillery with the Steens in Tullyallen. So he got into distilling despite the fact he was a lawyer here. Sir Robert Usher, who was the son of Andrew Usher, said in 1908 that the company's sales to England were modest prior to 1860, but following blending increased in leaps and bounds. So it became very much something that was acceptable to the consumer. It was acceptable to the licensee, and the distillers were happy with it as well. Then along came 1905, and in Islington, some publicans were charged with selling a product not of the specified, not of the quality and standard expected. So the publicans had sold blended whiskey, which contained grain whiskey and malt whiskey, and the people complaining argued that Scotch whiskey was only malt whiskey. And this was fought, obviously, by DCL, and they created a bottling of canvas, which, as you see on the label, it says, "Not a headache in a gallon." So you can drink a gallon of it and no headache. This was to counter that. They set up a Royal Commission, and it reported in 1908, and it found that there was no real difference between grain whiskey and malt whiskey, so therefore they could both be called Scotch whiskey. And that made a huge difference to them. 1860, we're seeing Irish whiskey losing its place around the world. As we went into the 1860s, there was a plant collector in Hastings who brought some American vines into Hastings, and within it was a little thing called Phylloxera vistatrix, which is a pest that attacks the roots of the vines, or the European vines rather, Vitis vinifera, and destroys the vine's immune system. So the vines across France started dying off from about 1880. That spread into Italy, that spread into Germany, it got over into, across the Pyrenees into Spain in the 1920s, and people had to grub up the dead plants and plant more. They eventually discovered by grafting the Vitis vinifera above the ground with the roots of the American vine Riparia or Berlandii, then it was phylloxera resistant. And around the world, the only country which has resisted phylloxera is Chile, and that is because you've got the Andes to the east, they've got the Pacific to the west, the Atacama Desert to the north, and the Antarctic to the south. There is no phylloxera in Western Australia, but you're not allowed to carry plant material from east to west in Australia. So if you walk onto a plane with an apple in Sydney heading west, you get it taken away from you. You're not allowed to take it. So phylloxera meant there was no wine made, or very little wine made, and so therefore there's no brandy. And the Scotch whisky distillers wandered around the world and offered their product to for people to put their soda into. So whiskey and soda became the big thing instead of brandy and soda on the back of that. Ireland went through its civil war with the war with the British, and basically on the back of that, the Commonwealth countries were not allowed to import Irish products. So Irish whiskey was very big in the United States and Canada. Prohibition came into the United States in 1920, and Scotch whiskey sent their whiskey into Canada, and it got into the United States from there. Al Capone made his fortune smuggling whiskey across the border from Canada. The Kennedys, the royal family in the United States, made their fortune smuggling whiskey across the border from Canada. But the Canadians were not allowed to import Irish whiskey, so their market in Canada and the United States dried up. And by 1960, we were down to 2 distilleries in the whole of Ireland. We're seeing huge growth at the moment in Irish whiskey, but I think the Scots are a wee bit complacent about it all at the moment. The Irish are really developing it well in the States. The growth in exports from Ireland is huge in terms of what it was 10 years ago. No, I won't do that. 2 world wars made a huge difference to Britain. After Scotch whisky, the sales went through the roof because people from Scotland took drinking Scotch whisky overseas with them. We had French sailors and airmen and Polish sailors and airmen and soldiers came into this country, picked up the habit of drinking Scotch whisky and took it home with them. And the sales grew enormously until 1978, where South America dried up overnight, and we had a huge whiskey lake, whiskey loch on the back of that by the early 1980s. Johnny Walker, one company, over budgeted by 1 million litres of alcohol in '79. That meant that they'd told all the distilleries that supply Johnny Walker that they would need, it would have been something like 20 million litres of alcohol. There were 1 million litres of alcohol out. That meant there was all that stock lying in the warehouses with no customer for it. Multiply that throughout the industry, and that's why we had a whiskey lock, and we were closing distilleries right, left, and centre in the 80s. Some of them, like Cambus and Carsbridge, never to open up again. This is a picture from around 1885 from Barnard's book. Alfred Barnard wandered round the distilleries of the United Kingdom and Ireland in 1885-86. His book was published in 1887, and that's a photograph or an etching from it. I have an original Barnard, which was rescued from a skip in 1987. Yeah, 1987. Diageo says wonderful things about its heritage, but in the 80s they were throwing them out, and I got an original Barnard on the back of it. I got several other books as well on the back of it, rescued from a skip, literally. So Carsbridge hit a world record in 1980, and the mash tun, the workers. When Barnard wandered round, there were 150 men working at the distillery. 40 of them were a fully trained fire brigade. There were 44 fire plugs on the premises. It covered 10 acres at that point. That's what it was in '76, and literally all that's left is, all that's left of the buildings is Carsbridge House up here. Oaklow House there and Harvey House there. That's it. Everything else is flattened. Supposedly turned into housing. Right, okay. Right, let's look at the canvas. So the first glass on your left is a 29-year-old canvas Distilled on the 8th of August 1991 and bottled the 15th of October 2020. The nose and the colour tells you it's a sherry cask. The richness coming through there. Those little things there, you put your thumb on the hole and you can drip the water in. There's a little bit of honey there. There's some dried fruit notes, as in the sherry notes. Maybe a little bit of nuttiness as well with water. And you should always add water. The addition of water creates an exothermic reaction. It raises the temperature by 2 degrees centigrade and releases aromas and flavors. So it makes it a bigger drink at the end of the day. So the water, there's some wood there, there's some vanilla notes, toffee, backed up by that fruit on the palate. But you're getting the wood flavors coming through there, very dominant, or fairly dominant in the flavor. So basically, this was bottled by Lady de Glen. If they had sat on this for another 5 or 6 years, it would have been too dominant. It's pretty noticeable. Alcoholic strength is 62.2. They would have filled the casks at about 72% alcohol in those days. Nowadays, most distilleries drop it to 63.5. A pot still production, two distillation will take you to 70, 72. Brewer laddie are playing around. Some casks are filling it at distillation strengths, others are dropping to 63.5. All the experimentation was done in the 80s and 90s, which is why the industry argues they moved to 63.5 at that point in time. Now, I'm fairly sure they moved to that because it's less flammable at 63.5 than it is at 72, so therefore the insurance premium is lower. But no one admits that. So on the palate, again, as I said, the wood flavors are coming a wee bit dominant there. Canvas was set up by John Mowbray in 1806, and as I said, it was converted in 1836. When Barnard went there, he recorded that they produced 4 million gallons of whiskey a year. The grain was delivered by sea or rail, and the rail track ran through the middle of the distillery, and as it still does. You know, the railway runs through the middle of the cooperage at the moment. It had 60 men working at it, and for some reason or another, they had 7 customs officers on site, which seems a bit excessive. Maybe they didn't trust the Mowbrays at that point. It covered 8 acres, and there was a fire in September 1914, which almost wiped it out, and it was closed till 1937. They went through the 20s, and obviously the United States dried up because of Prohibition, and they didn't start rebuilding it until 1934, and it was closed in 1993. So this is one of the last casks that came out of it. The Karst Bridge is a 28-year-old, vintage 1965, distilled on the 7th of November 65, bottled in October 94. This is from Signatory, so it's Educator. On the nose, you don't have that richness which you had with the sherry cask canvas. It is, there's a vanilla note from the wood. There's a little bit of shortbread note to it, maybe even bread, yeasty note to it, and some simple fruit, maybe maybe a little bit orange, but not much more. With water. With water, it seems to close up a bit. There are a little bit of licorice, a little bit of a slightly musty touch to it. On the palate, good body, nice richness to it, but there's still that slightly musty feeling to it, you know, licorice, and there's a lot of tannin coming through, so there's a lot of wood you're feeling on the tongue. You know, when you chew a tea bag, for example, you know, the tannin feel on the tongue, you're getting that there. Yes, you do get corky bottles of whiskey. I had 2 Glendronach in very quick succession in the 90s. The cork industry moved through 300 years of technology in about 20 years, and now there's one company guarantees no cork taint at all. Cork taint is known as 2,4,6-trichloroanisole. It's caused by this bacteria. It's a bacteria in the soil, indigenous in the cork, the cork oak forests of Portugal, Spain, and the Maghreb in North Africa. And in recent years, they've discovered if they leave the bottom, the cork is the bark of the tree, and they take, once the tree is 25 years old, they take the bark off every 9 years. And they've discovered if they leave the bottom meter on, there's much, much less incidence of corkiness. Back in the 90s, I reckon that you were one bottle in every case of wine was corked. So 1 bottle in 12. Others out there argued it was 1 bottle in 8. I have had 1 corky bottle in the last 2 years. So the problem is almost solved. Not quite, but almost. And you could be right, that could be corkiness. The third one, how are we doing for time? That's fine. The third one is north of Scotland, which is also known as Strathmore. North of Scotland was established in 1957 by George Christie. It cost him £10,000 to buy the site. He installed 3 continuous stills and initially produced patent malt whiskey. So he moved over to grain whiskey in 1960. In 1956, he bought a site near Kingusie, and he was going to establish Speyside malt whiskey distillery there. He started building in 1960, and he didn't produce his first spirit till 1990. Basically, he built when he had the money, and when he didn't have the money, he stopped. But he and his son also owned Glenturret for a number of years and sold it to Highland Distillers eventually. DCL bought it in 1980 and closed it in 82. On the nose, oh, that's rather nice. Toffee, really quite sticky, nutty toffee. A little bit of condensed milk. Yeah, condensed milk. Oh, yeah, that's rather nice. With water. It closes down a bit. Although, no, there's a fruit. Apple, no, pears coming out. But that toffee notes there at the back, really rather nice. On the palate. Mm. 33. 33, alcoholic content 56.7. Sorry? 56.7. So it was distilled, it's bottled by Ratry, who are down in Ayrshire in, I can't remember the name of the village. Sorry? Kirkoswald, that's it, thank you. Owned by Tim Morrison, ex of Morrison Bowmore. He now owns Clydeside Distillery in Glasgow. Distilled in 7th of December 72, bottled 20th October 2006. I was trying to remember the name of Kirkoswald the other day and it just couldn't come to me. Yeah. I meant to look it up. That's the only picture I've been able to find of north of Scotland, and as you see, it's a drawing. Time 42. Canvas, again, circa 1885. Oh, by the way, Karst Bridge had two very high chimneys. One was 100 feet high, one was 140 feet high, and one of them, the tallest one, was a landmark for people coming into Alloa for many, many years. They used coal to heat the stills. They used coal to dry the grain. Barnard records that Carsbridge had a grain loft 100 feet long by 40 feet wide, and it had a barley loft the same size. In 1885-6, when Barnard wandered round, technology wasn't there to cook the grain the way they do nowadays for continuous distillation. So whether it was barley or rye or wheat or corn, they laid it out on the maltings floor and did exactly the same as Bowmore, for example, does on a maltings floor, and dry it in a kiln. And they used coal because within this part of the world there were many coal fields. You know, people talk about the peat, and the Scotch whiskies historically using peat. Glenlivet imported peat from Orkney because they didn't have the quality of peat they needed in Speyside. Likewise, weirdly enough, Nick Morgan posted something last week or the week before, an article from a Fife newspaper dated 1855, and it was about peat coming from Orkney for Carsbridge Distillery. So they used peat as well as coal, but obviously this bringing peat in from Orkney is costing them money, but they were looking for the character which Orkney peat gave them. So it was, they were imaginative in those days as well. But throughout the area, coal was used. The Staines, for example, in 1790 paid 4 shillings a ton for their coal. That's 20 pence for those of you who are too young to remember that. So, on the palate, you haven't got, despite the fact that it's 8 years older, you haven't got the wood influence that you had on the on either the Canvas or the Karst Bridge. There's good richness there. There's it's not as dry as it was expecting. That's a sherry cask, I think. Probably a refill sherry. It doesn't say. No, it's a bourbon cask. But it's not a bourbon cask, but you've got a lot of richness coming through, so it must be a first fill bourbon cask. And really very good, I must admit. I'm surprised by that, to be quite honest. Canvas 1969, and you see the river coming down there. The railway Railway is there. And there's photographs from 1974 showing the chimney and the river. Apparently, Diageo have just bought the canvas pools. Don't know what they're going to do with them at the mouth of the river. The warehouses there are the largest bonded warehouses in the world, and it's getting even bigger. There, for example, is what is there now. The cooperage, that was taken before the cooperage had its renovation. If we go back. So, whiskey number 4 is something we decided to throw in because it does have a Clackmannanshire influence. It's an 18-year-old Jameson's. And it is the Bow Street Distillery. So it's matured for part of its life at Bow Street, which is now a museum. That's what it was when Barnard wandered round in 1885. What are you doing? And that's what it looks like nowadays. So this is distilled at Middleton down near Cork and finished for the last, probably the last 6 months of its life in the warehouses at Bow Street. See, still the influence from Clackmannanshire. Yeah, that's right. Pernod Ricard. Jameson, as I said, was a lawyer here. He took a share in the Bow Street Distillery with the Steens for 6 years, I think it was, and then he and his wife and children moved across to Ireland. He took over the Bow Street Distillery himself. And he had 7 sons. 6 of them got involved in distilling. 1 of them came back here and continued his legal practice in Alloa, but it became the #1 distillery, sorry, the #1 whiskey in the world for some years because of the amount that was being sold in the United States. It still is the biggest selling Irish whiskey. So on the nose, after the richness of the ones we've had before, it's quite light despite the fact it's 18 years old. There's a touch of orange, lemon there. There's a little bit of syrup and maybe demerara sugar. Alcoholic strength is 55.1. It opens out with the water. You've got a lot of toffee. You've got that condensed milk character again. Really some, a little bit of a floral note on the edge of it, on the palate. Yeah, but there's a waxiness there, which is a character of pot still production. Single pot still production in Ireland, they use malted barley and unmalted barley. So they reckon the unmalted barley gives them this waxy character, which is there and is a character they're looking for. But there's a continuous still down at Middleton, as well as pot stills, and out front of the distillery is what was the world's largest pot still. It was so large that there were stanchions welded onto it and supported by the ceiling to stop the whole thing collapsing in on itself. Because when it still collapses on itself, you get this implosion and you get fire and all the rest of it. We already mentioned a couple of fires, and we mentioned one fire on the fire brigade at Carsbridge, which was an essential part of it, because fires in distilleries can be fairly disastrous. So, like it? Yep. Good. Thank you for your attendance. Any questions? Just nail me in the next 5 minutes, 4 minutes, or something. But Clackmannanshire has always had an influence in whisky. Unfortunately, the one thing Clackmannanshire lacks at the moment is accommodation. You know, tourists who are coming here for the whisky connection want decent accommodation, and there's very little in Clackmannanshire. John Jameson is actually buried in the graveyard. Where are we? There, over there. Yep, over there. And to show the incest, no, not incest. He married, he married one of Haig's daughters. So there's this connection between the distilling families, the Steens, the Haigs, and the Jamesons. There always has been this connection. I've argued for, oh God, almost 40 years now, that the industry should have a marketing bureau. There's no one markets Scotch whisky. The Irish have just put in a system where they're marketing Irish whisky. The English have just put in a system where they're marketing English whisky. But the Scotch Whisky Association says, no, the industry doesn't want it. So effectively, what happens is that the various members of the Scotch Whisky Association, the companies within the, don't want to share ideas. They don't want to give marketing ideas to the competitors. But we're getting to the stage now where we're seeing, for example, 2003 or 2004, I got an email from a woman in the United States who was doing PR for the American Craft Distillers Association. And at that point in time, they had 36 or something like that members, and 32 turned up at their annual convention in wherever it was. In 2014, I got another email from her. They had 1,351 members by that point. A lot of these are producing malt whisky. Not all of them, but a lot of them are producing malt whisky in the United States, to the extent that the BATF, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco and Firearms, is setting down legislation for malt whisky production in the US. And yeah, it does. Yeah, it does. You know, yeah, the island of Tasmania has 33 malt whisky distilleries. France has got 80 malt whisky distilleries. And you think the Scotch Whisky Association is just sitting back and twiddling its thumbs? Sorry? Oh, yeah, India, absolutely. But remember, most Indian distilleries distill from molasses, so you and I would call it rum. The largest selling whisky in the world is Officer's Choice, which you have never heard of. It's an Indian whisky. It sells 32 million cases a year, 32 million dozen bottles. It's made from molasses. The second largest whisky is Bagpiper. Again, it's an Indian whisky. You don't get to Scotch whisky till somewhere like 8th, and that's Johnny Walker. It's up at, I think it's under 20 million litres of alcohol, under 20 million cases rather. Thank you for your time. We've overrun, I'm afraid.